She doesn't know yet, but by Thursday she won't have a job, a title, or a reference letter, and she won't see it coming. That was what Reginald Ashworth said to his business partner at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, standing in the kitchen of the house that Vera had helped him buy, in the city where she had built everything he was now preparing to take. He said it quietly, the way men say things when they're certain no one is listening. He was wrong. Vera Ashworth, Vera Kincaid, before the marriage, which she sometimes thought about now with something close to regret, was 41 years old and had not slept well in months. It wasn't the kind of insomnia that comes from anxiety. It was more like her body knew something her mind hadn't processed yet. She'd wake at 2 a.m. or 3 and lie in the dark listening to the house settle, to Reginald's breathing from the other side of the bed, to the particular silence of a marriage that had slowly become a performance. That Tuesday night she'd gotten up to get water. She wasn't creeping around, she wasn't suspicious. She was just thirsty, and the kitchen was downstairs. She heard his voice before she reached the bottom step. She stopped. She didn't move for 4 minutes. She counted them afterward, replaying the whole thing in her head, checking to make sure she'd heard correctly. She had, every word. Reginald's voice was low and careful. The voice he used in boardrooms when he wanted to sound reasonable while saying something unreasonable. He was on the phone with someone named Quentin. Quentin Brax, his business partner and the man who had been their guest at dinner 6 weeks earlier, who had praised her risotto and asked about her consulting work with what seemed like genuine interest. She's the one who built the client development framework, Reginald said. I know. But that's not in any contract. It was just how things worked when we were getting started. There's nothing on paper with her name on it. A pause. She'll push back, you know how she is. So we move first. HR goes to her Thursday morning, performance review, documentation, the whole package. By the time she lawyers up, we'll have already reclassified her role and shut down her access. And she won't have standing to claim anything from the partnership. Another pause. Yes, both companies. That's the point. Vera stood on the stairs with her hand on the wall and felt something move through her. Not panic, not grief, something quieter than either. It was the specific sensation of a door swinging open in a hallway she hadn't known existed. Everything she was looking at was the same. Everything she understood about it had just changed. She went back upstairs without the water. She did not go back to sleep. The full weight of it didn't land all at once. That's not how betrayal works, not the deep kind. It arrives in layers. The first layer was the immediate facts. Reginald had been her husband for 9 years. For 7 of those years she had also been the invisible architecture of his professional life, not officially, not on paper. That was the point. That was always the point, she understood now. When they had met, Reginald was running a mid-sized consulting firm in Toronto that was good but not exceptional. He had connections, a decent reputation, an office on King Street. What he didn't have was a system. Vera had systems. She'd spent 8 years before their marriage working in organizational development for a firm in Calgary, building internal frameworks that companies could actually use. She had a particular talent for seeing inefficiency, the places where good businesses leaked value, the gaps between departments, the meetings that were really just territorial disputes dressed up in agendas. She could walk into a company for a week and come out with a roadmap that would take them 3 years to implement, but that would, if followed, transform the operation. When she and Reginald got together, she'd started doing that work for his firm, informally at first. She had her own clients, her own income, her own life in Calgary. Then they got married and she moved to Toronto. Then it made sense for her to take on more of his firm's development work, because she was there anyway. Then her Calgary clients tapered off because she was committed here. Then her name was never on the firm's public materials, but her fingerprints were on everything. She had built his client development framework, a proprietary approach to identifying and onboarding clients that had, in 3 years, tripled the firm's retention rate. She had designed the internal review process his team now ran quarterly. She had written the pitch documents that won them their 3 largest accounts, all while drawing a modest consulting fee that was, she now understood, deliberately kept below the threshold that would require formal partnership documentation. Quentin had known. He'd always known. He'd hired her for 2 engagements through the firm and had thanked her graciously both times. And underneath that graciousness had been a careful accounting of exactly how exposed he would be if she ever decided to make things formal. The second layer was Reginald, not the professional part. That was almost clean in its clarity. The second layer was the marriage. The nights they'd spent sitting on the back deck in Cabottown talking about what they were building together. The way he'd said we when he talked about the firm's growth, right up until the point when it benefited him to say I. The particular intimacy of building something with someone, and then realizing they had always been keeping score in a ledger you weren't allowed to see. She lay in the dark on her side of the bed and listened to him breathing and thought, he has been planning this. Not impulsively, not recently. Thursday was too specific. HR documentation was too organized. This had been in motion for a while, which meant that every conversation they'd had in the last however long had been happening with this underneath it. She was very still. She did not cry. She was past the place where crying was the first response. She started thinking instead. Vera was not a person who made decisions quickly, which people sometimes mistook for passivity. It wasn't, it was precision. She had learned early that the difference between a reaction and a response was time, and that the people who acted immediately in high-stakes situations usually gave away information they couldn't afford to lose. Reginald expected her to find out Thursday morning, in a HR meeting she wasn't prepared for, with documentation she hadn't seen. His advantage was that she would be shocked, disoriented, and responding in real time. All of that depended on her not knowing she knew, which meant she had Tuesday night, all of Wednesday, and the first hours of Thursday morning before the meeting. 56 hours. She didn't waste any of them. The first call she made was at 7:15 Wednesday morning from her car with the engine running, parked 2 blocks from the house. She called Lorelei Nance. Lorelei was a labor and employment lawyer at a firm in Midtown, and she was also the most pragmatic person Vera had ever met. They'd been introduced through a mutual friend 6 years ago and had stayed in close enough contact that Vera had been to her wedding, and Lorelei had been to their housewarming. She was also, Vera suspected, going to be very interested in what she was about to hear. "I need to come in today," Vera said when Lorelei picked up. "Not as friends, as a client." There was a brief pause. "What happened?" "I overheard something last night. I'm going to need you to tell me what I actually have, legally. Before I talk to anyone else, I can move my 11 to 11:30. Be here at 10. Vera was there at 9:45. She laid it out carefully, all of it. The structure of her work for the firm over 7 years. The consulting arrangement and its deliberately kept informality. The framework she'd built. The client retention outcomes, which she had documentation of, because she kept records of everything she built as professional practice. The conversation she'd overheard. The Thursday timeline. Lorelei listened without interrupting. When Vera finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way she did when she was organizing her thoughts. "You have more than you think," Lorelei said. "The question is what you want. I want to move before Thursday. Then we have work to do." The second call was to her sister Nadine, who lived in Ottawa and worked in finance and had, for the last 2 years, been quietly expressing concern about things Vera kept dismissing. "I need to tell you something," Vera said. "And then I need your help with something specific," she explained. Nadine listened. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. "I knew it," Nadine said. Not triumphantly, sadly. "Vera, I'm so sorry. I knew it, I know you did. What do you need?" "I need to talk through the financial piece, our accounts. What's joint, what's separate, what I'm entitled to and how quickly I can move." They talked for 2 hours. Nadine was methodical about it, practical in the way only people who work with money every day can be, stripping out emotion and working through the facts. Vera had, in the early years of the marriage, kept some of her own professional earnings in a separate account. She'd stopped contributing to it regularly around year 5, when she'd let her independent practice go mostly dormant, but the account was still there. The joint accounts were where the bulk of the household money lived, along with a portion of the consulting fees she'd been receiving. Lorelei had already advised her on what she could and couldn't do with joint assets before filing. Vera had listened carefully and understood the line. She didn't cross it, but she understood exactly where she stood. Wednesday moved differently than other days. Vera went through the motions of a normal afternoon. She answered emails, she made dinner, she sat across from Reginald and listened to him talk about a client meeting, and asked follow-up questions in the right places and said nothing unusual. He was a good liar. She had always known that in the abstract. She was now watching it operate in real time, with the specific knowledge of what was underneath it, and she found that it clarified something she had spent years keeping deliberately blurry. She had been rounding up for this marriage. The way you do when you love someone and you want things to work and you take the parts that fit and you soften the parts that don't. She had been doing it for years and she could see now, looking at him across the dinner table, watching him perform normality with real skill, that he had never been rounding up. He had been calculating. She slept that night. Not well, but enough. She needed to be clear-headed in the morning. At 6 a.m., Thursday, Vera was already dressed and at the desk in the small office off the second bedroom that she used for her work. She had 2 folders open. She had a list. At 6:30 she sent Lorelei a message. "Ready. Proceed with the filing." Lorelei had spent Wednesday preparing a claim based on unjust enrichment and constructive trust. The legal argument that even without a formal partnership agreement, Vera's 7 years of documented contribution to the firm's value entitled her to recognition of that contribution. The documentation Vera had provided was substantial. Lorelei had described it, with characteristic understatement, as unusually well organized. Vera had always kept records. At 7:15, she forwarded a specific set of files to Lorelei, dated emails, version histories, her original design documents for the client framework, things that had lived in her own professional archive for years and that she had simply never had occasion to surface before. At 8:30, she sent Reginald's largest client, a mid-sized manufacturing company in Mississauga whose account she had personally developed, a note. Not an emotional note, a professional one. She introduced herself by her full professional name and her actual role in developing their engagement with the firm, noted that she was transitioning her consulting work, and asked whether they would be interested in a brief conversation about their ongoing needs. She had helped build every element of that relationship. They knew her voice, they would recognize the substance. She received a response within 40 minutes. At 9:15, the HR meeting was scheduled to begin. Vera wasn't there. She had sent a message to the HR director at 9:10 noting that she would not be attending and that her counsel had been in contact with the firm's legal department. She attached the initial filing documentation as a courtesy. She had heard from Lorelei that Reginald's response to this was not calm. She was not there to see it. She was at a coffee shop near Spadina with Nadine, who had driven down from Ottawa the night before, and they were drinking coffee and not saying very much and sitting with the complicated mix of grief and clarity that comes when the thing you hoped wasn't true turns out to be true, but at least now you know. "How are you?" Nadine asked. Vera thought about it honestly. "I'm not okay," she said, "but I'm standing up," which is more than he planned for. What happened next took months, not days. That's the part that stories sometimes skip. The long administrative reality of dismantling a life that had been built over 9 years. The legal process was slow and occasionally grueling. Reginald's lawyers were good. Lorelei was better, and more importantly, she had documentation that Reginald had spent years assuming didn't exist. The constructive trust claim was novel enough that it attracted some attention within the firm's professional circle, which Vera had not anticipated and did not particularly enjoy. She had not set out to make a point. She had set out to protect what was hers. The Mississauga client moved their account. They cited a preference for continuity of the relationship. They were polite about it. They had always liked Vera. 2 other clients followed within 6 weeks, once word circulated that she was operating independently again. She had been out of the market for years, but the work was still in her portfolio, and the relationships were still there, dormant but intact. She set up her own practice again, small, deliberately. She wasn't trying to rebuild an empire. She was trying to rebuild a life that was actually hers. The divorce was finalized 11 months after that Thursday morning. The settlement acknowledged her contribution to the firm's development in concrete terms. It was not everything she deserved. It was significantly more than Reginald had intended to give her. Quentin Brack sent her an email 3 months after the settlement. It was carefully worded. It acknowledged, without quite admitting, that the situation had been handled poorly. He wished her well. She read it once and did not reply. There was a detail that Vera thought about sometimes, after everything. When she had been standing on those stairs at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, in the dark, listening, there was a moment just before she turned to go back upstairs when she almost walked into the kitchen. She almost confronted him right there. The anger was real enough. She had felt it rise in her chest and start moving toward her throat, and for 2 or 3 seconds it would have been very easy to push through that door and say, "I heard you, I heard everything." And if she had done that, she would have had the satisfaction of seeing his face. She would have had that one moment of watching him realize that his plan had been exposed. And then he would have known. He would have had time. He would have locked down accounts and called his lawyers and managed the narrative and given her nothing but her own anger to work with. She turned around instead. She went back upstairs. She lay in the dark and she was still. Not because she wasn't angry, she was. Not because she didn't feel it, she did. But she had learned, somewhere in 41 years of watching how the world worked, of being the person in the room who built things other people took credit for. She had learned that the most powerful thing you can do with what you know is decide, carefully, how and when to use it. The people who underestimate you are counting on your emotion. They are counting on you to react in the moment, to spend your energy on the confrontation, to make it about the feeling rather than the outcome. She didn't give him that. She gave him Thursday morning. She gave him a coffee shop near Spadina and a filing she'd never seen coming. She gave him the experience of being the one who didn't know until it was too late. That, more than anything, was the thing he had never planned for. Not her anger, her patience, not her grief, her records. He had spent years building a version of events in which Vera was a supporting character, a wife, a consultant, a warm body in a house on a street in Cabottown. Useful, manageable, not quite visible. He had built that story carefully and believed it completely. And she had simply kept a different set of records. The records told the truth. The records told it in dates and emails and version histories and client communications and outcomes, documented with the specificity of someone who knew, on some quiet level, that the day might come when she'd need them to speak for her. When that day came, they did.